So, welcome everyone here in the room in Berlin and also all the people following us online. Happy to see that so many people found their way to this Congress again this year. Today is the second and last day of the sessions in presence. Tomorrow we'll continue to discuss online only. So enjoy the presence of your fellow humanitarian colleagues to discuss during the breaks, but also during in the corridors and at the forum booth downstairs. Yesterday, we became thrilling insights in many of the dilemmas that we face more and more as humanitarian actors. As crises follow crises in a rhythm that seems to be accelerating at a pace that makes one dizzy. Between the war in Ukraine and the Middle East, is there a chance to not ignore or at least neglect the devastating conflict in Sudan? Is this infernal cycle of crisis inhibiting our capacity to reflect on new ways to conceive our interventions? Are we rather perpetuating structural injustice and colonial attitudes? Are we even losing faith in our own capacity of compassion while facing so many brutal wars and aggressions, so much political cynicism, even criminalization of life-saving, as well as an accelerating and seemingly unstoppable climate crisis? Speakers, panelists, and participants try to sort out the humanitarian challenges of today and tomorrow and better explain their root causes. It is important that we keep looking ruthless at ourselves, even if sometimes it seems we keep repeating the same ideas under new and fancier names, decades after decades. The overwhelming tasks in front of us are challenging our capacity to seek for innovative solutions. More and more, we need endurance. We need to be ready for the long run, even if humanitarian aid seems to be rooted in the immediacy and the short term. In the whirlwind of global crisis surrounding us, we need more than ever to take a step back, to reflect, rethink, reinvent our priorities. Less and less an easy task. But would we be here these days if we don't believe that we still can tackle it? Just 2 sentences from yesterday's discussions. Isabel Shayani said during the first round of the talks, being here will help us keeping hope, recharge batteries, and readjust our compass. In another discussion in the afternoon, Nina Troy noted that humanitarians underestimate their own impact and influence. We at MDM, we used to claim that we focus our advocacy and humanitarian intervention on neglected and marginalized populations, even if not in the spotlight and if attention moves on. I pretend this is still our compass. It is the goal of this Congress to gather together and take time from our busy lives to regain some confidence in the role we can still play. More than ever, we need to profoundly rethink our models and ways of doing. I hope this Congress will give us inspiration and be one significant step ahead. Before introducing the next keynote conversation, let me address a special thanks to a less visible partner we gained this year for the Congress. Let me name the Center for Humanitarian Change, based in Nairobi. This is our knowledge partner this year, helping us to sharpen and critically reflect on our panel outlines. You help us to detect bias and ingrained structures foster a more open and critical approach. Thank you very much for that. The keynote conversation today will be introduced and facilitated by Ed Schenkenberg van Mierop, Executive Director of HERE-Geneva, an independent think tank on humanitarian policy and practice. Ed, you have the floor.
Guten Morgen zusammen. Good morning, everyone in the room and online. Welcome to day 2 of the Humanitarian Congress Berlin. Out of sight, out of mind is the issue that we will be looking at. And today, and particularly this morning, we're discussing what I would call inconvenient truths in the international failures to respond to humanitarian crises. We'll have 2 very exciting speakers. I will introduce them to you in a moment. Decades have gone by of discussions on how to improve humanitarian response, how to make humanitarian response more effective and efficient. And yet, I imagine many of you here in the room and online have been witness of failures to do so and to become more effective. Still, we're looking at many obstacles and barriers to more effective international and humanitarian response. And I'm sure we'll go into, particularly Tirana and Sorcha will go into a number of those examples in a moment. It might be the lack of funding. It might be the lack of access and security that inhibit us. But as a director of MSF UK used to say, a former director, those should only be reasons to try harder. So these factors of neglect, these issues that at the moment are in our way to react better, more effectively to crises. How can we get past them, or how can we get them out of the way? So I hope that today, in that sense, will be as inspiring and motivating as it was yesterday. And certainly also hearing from François and seeing some of your discussions yesterday online. I believe you already had a very exciting day, and I'm sure today will be as interesting and inspiring as such. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Tirana Hassan. Tirana is the executive director. I don't think, Tirana, you even need an introduction. Still, for those of you who might not know, for the very few of you who might not know Tirana, she's the executive director of Human Rights Watch, has been so since September last year, started her career decades ago, I believe, in legal assistance to refugees. Later on, joined the Emergency Department of Human Rights Watch, the Crisis Response Division of Amnesty International, and then particularly since last year took over the helm from Ken Roth at Human Rights Watch. Tirana, the floor is yours. Please join me in welcoming Tirana Hassan.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. We'll just try and get set up here for a second. Now, will you actually help us on time? Is that okay, Ed? Because
I'll do my best.
You know, I've never struggled with taking up too much time when given a podium and a microphone. But it's a pleasure to be here with you today. It is actually nice to be back with MSF. The one thing that Ed missed in my bio was that I'm a recovering MSFer. So I spent a year in the field with the Somalia mission, with the operational centre in Amsterdam. But my experience both in the humanitarian world and the human rights world has, I think, given me some very interesting perspectives on how do we bring about change and how do we tackle some of the hardest, most intractable humanitarian situations in the world. And so today I wanted to spend a few minutes to encourage us to think about what causes the failure to respond, but also the question maybe that we don't ask ourselves enough, which is, how do you make a crisis a crisis? Because I think what we spend a lot of time doing, both in the human rights field and in the humanitarian sector, is that we speak about crisis and we speak about, the challenges in a vacuum. And one of the most pressing issues in front of us is, how do we get the world to care? So, I think when Ed was describing, when François was describing the current situation in the world, whether it's the escalating conflict in Israel and Palestine, whether it's the climate crisis, it can all feel a little apocalyptic. And the reality is that is the context where we are trying to get the world and get policymakers and get funders to care and engage on humanitarian action. And it's really important that we are cognizant of that, but we are not demoralised. And I personally always think about the quote from Margaret Mead, which is, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world, because indeed it is the only thing that ever has. And when you think about the forgotten humanitarian context that we're discussing today, I replace the small group of committed citizens with a large group of people wearing multi-pocketed vests and logoed T-shirts living in communal housing. But it is important that we see ourselves, whether you are a humanitarian worker or you are a human rights advocate or you are a policy analyst, we start to see ourselves as part of the change process. We are all part of a bigger ecosystem and we all have a part to play. And I think that one of the challenges we have is we always think that if we see ourselves as part of a discussion, we risk jeopardizing neutrality, and I'd like to come back to that. But first of all, I want to refer to, what is it that is causing a bit of a failure to respond? How is it that we have so many humanitarian situations that fall into the bucket of inaction and neglect? And that is not a question of whether or not it is important, whether or not we feel that there is a moral imperative. I think a large portion of unfunded or neglected humanitarian situations is actually a result of how the global humanitarian architecture is designed. Because it is how the global architecture is designed and what happens in the more global multilateral systems that determines if responses are funded or they are unfunded. But that's only half of it. Because the reason behind funding being available for humanitarian crises is not one of a moral imperative by governments. It is geopolitics. And I think it would be naive for us to continue to think that the world is operating purely on principle. It is our responsibility to get actors within the global sphere, get governments and states to care about the situations that may not be on their own agenda. One of the things that we are seeing in the world, it is becoming increasingly transactional. Whether we're talking about public policy or public funding. These issues are fundamentally ones of political transaction, no longer based on the moral imperative or even on, principles of, shared humanity. It's not altruistic. And when geopolitics and shifting power is responsible for driving the humanitarian agenda and the humanitarian funding model, it leads itself to abuse and misuse. And it also leads itself to a situation where we have increasing double standards. I want to give you an example of the misuse and abuse situation. Now, one of the contexts that comes to mind where global politics intervene significantly on if and how a humanitarian response could be resourced is Yemen. At one point in time in 2017, I believe it was, the entire humanitarian response within the UN funding structure was essentially funded by one source. Can you guess who that was? It was Saudi Arabia. So ironically, here we have a situation where the funding for a humanitarian crisis is essentially driven by one of the parties to the conflict, coming through the UN system. But what we also had was, what does that buy Saudi Arabia? What does that buy governments to be able to, use the humanitarian system in that way? It dictates how the scale of the crisis, the scale of the response that is made available. And in this particular instance, Saudi had control over the amount of resources. No other governments were coming forward. And so when Saudi Arabia was then listed as under Security Council, what they call Resolution 1612, which refers to countries that are listed for human rights abuses against children in armed conflict. When Saudi Arabia was listed as one of the countries that was committing abuses against children, it was primarily through bombardments of school and destruction of schools and the wounding and killing of children, what did it do? It didn't say that it was going to correct its ways. There wasn't any pressure to try and get Saudi to actually abide by international law. Saudi Arabia said to Ban Ki-moon at the time, we're going to withdraw our funding from the humanitarian sector. And it was a threat that was used until they were taken off the list. And so I tell you this story because it is impossible. And it is impossible to think about politics and geopolitics separate to humanitarian action. And the humanitarian architecture is very much entrenched in what is happening. Mm. And I say this because geopolitics is shifting in ways that we have not seen before. We've always had tectonic shifts in the world in terms of power, but the multilateral systems that we rely on to generate attention on forgotten crises, to generate funding from governments, is essentially in peril. We have states like Russia and China who are systematically looking at which countries and which humanitarian crises are being responded to and which ones we classify as a crisis. And Sudan is the best example of this. Right now, we sit in a situation where where history is repeating, but a humanitarian crisis of an enormous scale is continuing to unfold with very little attention and very little condemnation or consequence to those who are perpetrating the crimes in Sudan. And it is really that it's not because governments don't care. Human Rights Watch, my organisation, has been involved in advocacy with the Security Council to try and urge the Council to take action on Sudan because of not just the humanitarian crisis, but also of the fact that history is repeating itself and we know the direction of travel that this is taking. Many of us in this room, and I actually am delighted to share a stage today with Sorcha, who she and I worked together 20 years ago in Darfur. And to watch the humanitarian crisis unfold in pretty much exactly the same way as it did 20 years ago is not only heartbreaking, it should be enraging. It should be enraging that hospitals are being attacked. It should be enraging that all of the humanitarian stores across Darfur have been looted. It should be enraging that we are still at a stage where women are being targeted and raped because of their ethnicity, and nothing is happening. But make no mistake, we have seen humanitarian actors speaking out about this, and I can tell you that how do you make a crisis a crisis? How do we make the world care about a context like Sudan? It is by speaking out. I understand the dilemma of balancing the operational presence with the responsibility, as MSF calls it, témoignage. Others within this room may call it advocacy or their policy work. Those two things, I would argue, and I would like you to consider, are no longer things that can be separated because they are inherently ingrained. A crisis is not a crisis until we push governments to look past their own political agendas, until we get global powers to actually start thinking about the criteria that they apply. And the people that are going to do that are those people who are bearing witness. And that is humanitarian actors and human rights researchers. But we do very different things. In the human rights world, we talk about accountability. That is not the job of the humanitarian sector. The humanitarian imperative is to provide that life-saving assistance. However, both of those things, the accountability and life-saving assistance, are an important part of the solution, an important part of relieving suffering at this particular point in time. If we try and pretend that those two things can be separated, then I think we're just being a little bit naive. And I would encourage us to think more about, actually to reflect on the comment that was made yesterday that I just heard François reference, which is humanitarians often underestimate influence. And I couldn't agree more. You don't have, just by speaking out and bearing witness, you can change the political trajectory, you can change the conduct of warring parties in ways that a detailed 500-word report from Human Rights Watch never can. And I can tell you from experience that sitting in front of policymakers may not be the purview of all of you in this room in the humanitarian sector. But when I sit down with policymakers and my colleagues sit down and we tell them what we've documented, they listen. But often it takes a much more human response to actually get policymakers to act. And that humanity comes from you, from the people who are working with affected communities and from affected communities themselves. And part of our role, as all of us, as actors in this international structure, operating in the corridors of power within the international community, we need to be able to create space that brings the humanity back into the room, that pushes past the sort of politics of the transactional politics I was referring to, and pushes policymakers, funders, and the media to start talking in real terms about crises that may not be on the agenda and are not on the agenda because they are not convenient for the global powers. So all I would say is that, you know, we have many challenges in the world. The truth is one of those challenges. Apparently we live in a world where the truth is up for debate. And the importance of, you know, your voices, coupled with the voices of others, of journalists, of human rights organisations, of policy think tanks, is critical in establishing the independent narrative, the truth, and ultimately the impetus for change.
Thanks so much, Tirana, for that. I thought a couple of very stark reminders. Whether we like it or not, we're part of an international architecture that is increasingly failing. But, and I think you also really pointed to that, we do have our voice. We can mobilize our forces as civil society organizations. There is our call to action. And we can also serve as actors that remind governments and international institutions for the need of accountability. So with that, let me invite Sorcha O'Callaghan to the podium. Sorcha has a bit of a similar history to you, Tirana. Also worked in her early days with refugees and asylum seekers. Worked for a long time with British Red Cross. And then moved to the humanitarian think tank domain. She is the director of the Humanitarian Policy Group of ODI. has long experience on issues such as protection and rights. Sorcha, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ed, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this really important topic and to share the conversation with the brilliant Tirana. So we know we live in a reality, what some described yesterday as a triangle of sadness, where a lack of media attention, lack of political interest, and lack of donor funding combine to create situations where entire populations are living in appalling conditions, out of sight, out of mind. We've heard from Tirana about the situation in Sudan, which many of us 20 years ago were engaged in and were trying to grapple with the media attention and a disproportionate political interest which skewed the response in Sudan. We now have 6 million people displaced, people suffering atrocities across Sudan, and there's barely a ripple in Europe, in the US, and in response to the crisis there. We know that entire populations are being left behind in Bangladesh without a state, without the chance to work, to seek education, and to move. And we know entire populations in northeast Syria earlier this year who had survived atrocity crimes were left behind to fend almost entirely alone with an earthquake of deadly proportions. We talk a lot about the wider environment, but I think it's just too simple to blame politics, the media, and external forces. We work in an industry that last year spent $47 billion assisting people in crises. We have choices about how those millions and billions are spent. We have influence. We direct our organizations, their choices and their focus. Yes, we are subject to manipulation. Yes, we operate in a political environment, but we shape that environment and we have responsibilities to do that. So I want to talk about the influence that we have as humanitarians, how we use that influence and how we're failing to respond and to adhere to the principle of humanity. That is our principle, and that we have decided is the focus of our efforts. So first of all, too often, we neglect those crises where people are most at risk of death and dying, because too often it's money, not a humanitarian imperative, that is our first priority. And I think one of the most stark examples for me of this was last year with Ukraine and the Horn of Africa crisis. So we know in Ukraine that it was a particular case. We know that it was in Europe. We know that proximity plays an important role. But a week after the invasion of Ukraine, $1.5 billion had been pledged overnight. In the UK, the Disaster Emergency Committee, a group of 15 leading organisations, had raised $55 million in 24 hours, a Guinness World Record. By September, it had raised $420 million. This had dwarfed almost the entire 75 previous DEC appeals. And this is despite a difficult reality. First, that much of the humanitarian response in Ukraine is not life-saving. Yes, it's playing a critically important role in alleviating appalling suffering in Ukraine, but much of the response is not life-saving. And there are questions, too, about the appropriateness of an international response when much of the operations there were started from scratch in a society with really strong national capacities. So there are real questions about the effectiveness of the response and the ability of internationals to actually reach the people who are most acutely in crisis. Meanwhile, in June last year, you will remember the horrific alarms in the Horn of Africa, that it was facing a 40-year record drought and reports of a person dying every 40 seconds. At a roundtable HPG held with senior humanitarian leaders in the UK, it was clear that despite this once-in-a-lifetime situation in the Horn, the DEC hadn't raised an appeal, and the 15 member organisations, most of those had also not appealed. Some were still talking about resilience in the Horn of Africa. So clearly the media should be paying more attention to this. Clearly politicians should be raising it up their agendas. But where were we? Why were humanitarians not banging on the table about the Horn of Africa? Why were we not facilitating media visits? And why weren't we making the case with our publics and our donors to transfer some of the resources from a very heavily invested in Ukraine response to the Horn of Africa? So we must admit this unpalatable truth that the humanitarian system, not just politicians, not just the media, is failing to respond in places like the Horn, in part because we were following, not trying to drive attention. The second thing I'd like to focus on is within crises, where protection issues are often neglected and the people who are most at risk often not reached and responded to. So whether it's the protection of people in Sudan today, the Rohingya in Myanmar, sexual violence in DRC, too often we fail to understand that protection is core to the humanitarian endeavour. We still don't know what it means for humanitarians to work on protection and how to prioritise it. We undertake technical assistance programming, important. Child-friendly spaces are great, and women-friendly spaces are important, but we're not speaking out, we're not putting protection at the core of what we do, and seeing that the reason why these crises are unfolding is because deliberate efforts to attack and target civilian populations. Secondly, in so many crises, the key people who are at risk, their needs are excluded from humanitarian action. Yes, security and access constraints are incredibly difficult, and we try our best to get around them. But even when we do have access, we often fail to engage with the people who are most at risk of death. We know of years of humanitarian action in Somalia. Who is most at risk? It is the marginalised. It is those populations who are discriminated against. It is those lower clan groups who die in disproportionate numbers in Somalia. We know in North and East Nigeria that the main response is focusing on women and girls. Why are men being let out of the response? Why are they not allowed into the garrison towns because of security situations? And we know in many contexts, whether it's Sudan, whether it's Ethiopia, Yemen, or Somalia, that aid is actually compounding for some people, not alleviating the suffering as it's part of the aid economy. Where are our strategies to address this? Why is this not core to our humanitarian endeavours in these responses? Too often, we don't see the people who are most at risk because we don't understand, we choose to ignore, or it's too difficult to engage with the political reasons that give rise to these vulnerabilities in the first places. We focus on counting humanitarian needs, on responding to the most people in crisis rather than targeting those people who are most at risk. And finally, I think we're neglecting acute needs because we're not using all the resources at our disposal. So take Sudan at the moment. There is a major humanitarian crisis unfolding. The international humanitarian response is largely paralysed. It's stuck in Port Sudan, a difficult 24 hours from Khartoum, even longer from Darfur. It's struggling to get financial resources into Sudan and difficult to respond due to looting and insecurity. Yet, despite a $2 billion humanitarian appeal for Sudan, only $1 million so far has been channeled to the extraordinary Sudanese mutual aid effort that is unfolding across cities and humanitarian kind of situations in Sudan. You have diaspora channeling funding into the pockets of Sudanese that have been displaced. You have information campaigns helping Sudanese get to safety, and you have whip-arounds in markets trying to help local Sudanese deal with this huge humanitarian crisis. Why are we not, as a humanitarian community, calling out for support to these groups? The same is true in Myanmar, where we know much of the traditional aid effort is coordinated through a junta, which is denying access to places across Myanmar, where it's seeking to control aid, weaponize humanitarian action, and cut off aid to starved populations. There is a cross-border response there, again, a local Myanmar response. Why are we not supporting those? Why do we not see that this is part of our humanitarian responsibility? And the picture is the same in Ukraine, Ethiopia, Syria, and elsewhere. Yes, there are political risks to working with non-neutral actors, but the humanitarian consequences are even greater. So a few ways forward in this depressing picture. The first is that we must recognize that it's our responsibility as humanitarians to drive media, political, and donor attention to those most in need. And that the first step is for us to work within our organizations. We're doing work at the moment looking at humanitarian reform in HPG. And one of the critical findings is the disjuncture between the operational and policy ethos of humanitarian organizations that may be focusing most on need, and the fundraising and media departments that are looking more at the bottom line and at headlines and how we, incentivize and create a situation where we're following money. So there is a vision of success within the humanitarian system at the moment that is built around growth, which is fundamentally at odds at focusing on neglected crises, difficult to reach populations, and frankly, more costly responses. So we need to change this logic within our organizations and across the sector. Second, I know that with such high levels of global need at the moment, responding at scale will always be a responsibility. But if humanitarian action is about saving lives and not just alleviating suffering, this needs to be balanced with a much stronger focus on protection and on engaging those populations who are most hard to reach and most at risk. And finally, if we want to care about challenging risk, we need to think about all our resources at our disposal. And this means we need to be much more pragmatic about supporting effective local responders, including those who work on one side of a conflict, because they're the ones that are often able to access those most at risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorcha. You started off saying it's too simple to put the blame somewhere else, and let's take a look at ourselves. I think you pointed to some very interesting numbers also. I think I heard you say 1 million went to local Sudanese civil society of the 2 billion appeal. And then both of you, of course, very much stressed also that part of our role in terms of advocacy and protection is particularly also our courage to raise our voice and to speak out on those situations. So let me start particularly on that point. I will open the floor at some point, both to you in the room and online. And please, for those of you online, you can use the chat, I believe, to raise your questions. Obviously, there's also the hashtag HC Berlin for your social media channels that you should use. Being the chair of this morning's discussion, I have the advantage, I can ask them the first question. So if you allow me, going back particularly to you, Tirana, this question, which obviously is we have worked on this, in particular in MSF, but also other organizations worked on this for so many years. How do you strike the balance between speaking out and the risks that may involve and the need to stay present? is there, you know, and how does that then relate to quote unquote our neutrality? And I know this is not a new debate whatsoever, but increasingly I have the feeling that particularly local civil society, human rights defenders, feel kind of isolated because they don't get our support. What would you say on that?
So first of all, I mean, I think that we need to also debunk some of the myths that we've created or the stories we tell ourselves about the absolutism of speaking out means zero operational presence. That is just not true. There are so many ways that you can bring important information in front of the people who need to hear it that doesn't involve you know, having to speak out publicly in the same way. Strategic interviews with key news outlets, for example. Stick to the facts. It doesn't have to be hyperbole and hyperbolic. You have numbers. You have data. Data matters in a post-truth world. Use your data. It is one of the most powerful things, I think, that you would be able to leverage. Also, the idea of briefing policymakers is, you know, in closed doors is just as powerful as it is when you sit in front of the Security Council and an ARIA formula, which I know that many of your organisations have, and brief the global and change the global discourse in that way. But also, you know, think about who you partner with. You know, we have for many years, you know, partnered with many humanitarian organisations to ensure that the information can get out. And there are still ways to do that. And I want to just say one thing about your last point, Ed, around how do local human rights, local organisations and human rights defenders, those on the front line feel about it, is like, yes, they can be disappointed. But the disappointment doesn't come from the not speaking out. The disappointment comes from this, this idea that the work they're doing would jeopardise your important work. Actually, the work they're doing will make your work and bring security and safety to the people that you are in service of. And the last thing I would say on that is that be mindful that the way that the context we are now working in are evolving is that the risks to human rights defenders and local organisations who speak out is just as high as it is for a humanitarian organisation. Right. There are more human rights defenders being put in prison. There are more human rights defenders who are being arrested and killed than we have ever seen in our history. And that isn't just in context of humanitarian crises and conflicts, that we're talking about environmental defenders, we're talking about people who are operating in so-called democracies. So we are all calculating risk every day. And I think it's just an important thing to understand that those people who are speaking out, we all have our mandates, but everybody's calculating risk, and we can do the same in the humanitarian sector.
Thanks, Tirana. Let me immediately move on then to Sorcha. Sorcha, you spoke very much about the need, so building on what Tirana just said, the need to include protection in our work. We have tried to do so for years, if not decades. We're still not very good at it. It seems there are some institutional hurdles. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? And what particularly, if you would mention one or two things that would actually make us get better at including protection and particularly rights in our work, what would they be?
Just checking that this is on. Yeah, I think we are failing on protection. I think the first starting point is actually to think about crises as humanitarian crises that require assistance, and to forget or not recognise or just not really have central to our understanding that these are often deliberate crises where civilians are deliberately targeted because of their ethnicity, because of their role, because of, you know, the role that they're perceived to play in a military crisis. And we come in, you know, with our assistance, that is water and sanitation, that is setting up camps, and we slightly forget that that's actually what's going on. And we don't engage, wholly and have that as our strategic kind of central node in terms of what we're doing. Yes, we're providing people with food in order to survive, but we're there because they're being deliberately targeted, because they're caught up in this conflict. And that should be kind of core and central to our strategic effort. And I think too often it isn't. And so that would be the first thing that I would say, is that we need to kind of be much more alive to the fact that in most protracted crises that we're dealing with, it is conflict and the deliberate targeting of civilians that is causing that crisis. And that needs to be core to what we do. I think oftentimes because of competition, mandate-driven responses between different organizations, we're not coalescing around this core issue. In situations, and I mean, you talk about it, Ed, like Ethiopia, there isn't a consolidated, recognized position at the UN country team, at the humanitarian leadership about what to do with protection. And so it's delegated down to a technical, often under-resourced protection cluster that is trying to think about what programs they can run. Yeah. These are important programs. I'm not undermining it. I think it's critically important that we work, to alleviate the suffering and to think about how we support children and women that are affected by these crises. But we need to have, at the center of the humanitarian response, in the humanitarian coordinator's office, a dedicated protection strategy and capability that is driving the humanitarian response and is thinking about how we deal with the core atrocities in those crises. That might be thinking about how we strategically advocate, publicly or in private. It might be thinking about which are the core protection issues that we want to engage in and which agencies are best placed to do it. But at the moment, we're dealing with it as a kind of a technical programmatic issue and not the central issue for many of the crises that we're working in.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I'm going to, yes, I know we're also stretched for time, but I'm going to open the floor for one or two questions. Ralph, please. It's the one person I know in the audience.
Thank you. Ralf Sütter from the Center for Humanitarian Action based here in Berlin. Many thanks for the discussion, very interesting. I would like to come to one point mentioned, I think, in both your key inputs and maybe building it a bit on the overall discussion of the conference and beyond. Sometimes it feels a bit like there are two schools how to deal with this issue of less and less attention for humanitarian issues, less and less potential to get attention on it in the political arena. There seems to be, on one hand, the school where we just need to speak up louder and to make louder our course and to make the course of a value-driven approach and an agenda which should really follow the very principled approach. And we need to protect at the same time our bubble while complaining that we don't get out of the bubble very often. And the other approach, which I heard a bit also on the operational level more from Sorcha, is more like, well, we have to jump on other issues. We have to get out of our own silo also in terms of narratives. Next week we will launch together with the HPG a study on humanitarian narratives, for example, trying to explain the German rise as a humanitarian donor. And of course, analyzers demonstrated it's very, very much linked to the migration issue. And now we have a major security debate by nature, while we have very little influence on, well, what's the human security dimension, for example, in strategic discussions in Germany and internationally, from my view. So my question would be, what would you recommend, which school to follow? Tirana, I thought I hear from you, well, just speak up louder. And the people will listen, and politicians do listen, but do they really act on what they heard when they have to make the balance? Or how do we deal with this, that we might need to jump on this interest-driven momentums of security, migration, etc., but we need to protect our principled mandate, our approach, our value-driven approaches at the same time? That would be great to learn more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. Is there one more volunteer for a question? Yes, please, in the back. I think it's Niels. It is Niels. Niels, wait for the microphone, please.
said, hi, yes, and yes, it is the other guy you know in the audience. So, quick question probably to Sorcha, but possibly also to all of us. You flagged the $2 billion UN appeal to Sudan, the million that's been put out for local actors. If you're looking at those who have been first and most effectively involved in the response, it's the emergency rooms associated with the resistance committees, so possibly a politically associated actor. They've had soft pledges from the international actors of $2 million to date. 5 months, bar 4 days from when the crisis started, $150 miserable $1,000 have actually made it into a response. The rest is still being negotiated between back donors, international NGOs, UN agencies, and the emergency response room. Sorry, I'm a bit passionate about this one. So question back to you, Sorcha, and to the rest, and all of us. Is the problem here with the back donor, or is it within our own identity construction, individually and institutionally, the business model we are operating that's blocking us from moving faster in this situation and in many others, where we're completely ignoring these true first responders? Because we can't take it in that we are not. So that's the question back to you. Do you want to unpack a little bit what's the blockage?
Thanks, Niels. Sorcha, and then Tirana.
So on Ralph's question about do we just speak louder and how much do we, I guess, engage with the geopolitical environment that allow certain crises to be prioritized. I mean, I think we need to do both and more. I guess, first of all, I guess I do think, with Israel and OPT today, it is important to engage with the attention that is occurring and try to shape it to ensure that the focus is on not the collective punishment of populations, to speak out about the fact that, even wars, even conflicts that have been started by terrorist campaigns have limits, and that we have a responsibility to protect civilians on both sides in that conflict. So I think we need to engage when there is high levels of attention to shape that attention. I think we also need to, probably even more so, shout louder and try to shape when there isn't attention, and see that really as a humanitarian responsibility. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think part of that is about getting our own sector and our house in order so that we're, I guess, coherent and collectively engaged as organizations around that. On Sudan, I couldn't agree more, Niels. When I'm talking about local responders in Sudan, I am talking about the emergency response rooms, the trade union groups, the women's groups, the medical groups that are providing mutual aid in a very networked, chaotic, kind of disorganized, but incredibly effective way. And the $1 million that has, if I understand correctly, and I'm not sure that the figures are absolutely right, but I know it's been pledged in terms of trying to get funding to local actors and some of those mutual aid actors. But I think, there is an overall infrastructure around this that is problematic. That means that we're not ceding power across the international response sector, whether that's from donors, from UN agencies, from INGOs, to national and local responders. So there's an issue of kind of transfer of power and resources. There's also an issue of just expecting these national actors to be like us and to act like us. But actually, frankly, we shouldn't want them to be like us because we don't have that access and we don't have that capability. They have a tremendous capability of responding in a situation like Sudan because they're not neutral actors and because they're on the ground. And I do think NGOs actually play a particular responsibility here because they can engage with more flexibly with some of these groups. They can take some of the risk. And many of the organizations in this room and across the humanitarian sector have been working in Sudan for decades, and so do have more trust and do have more engagement with donors, and so can set up small, it doesn't need to be huge, but surely if there's a $2 billion appeal, surely a certain proportion of that can be risked to get funding quickly to emergency response rooms and to national organisations in Sudan, who are working in Khartoum, working in Darfur, and working in places that the international response can't reach. Thanks,
Sorcha. Tirana, please.
I'll be quick because I know we're at time. And there's a gentleman here who keeps on flashing up cards. And it's like being a gymnast in the Olympics. He holds up a card that says 10, and I'm like, oh, thank you. But anyway, so to answer your question, I would say, I don't say shout louder. I think shout smarter, not louder. And think about the environment that we're operating in and what is the change that we want to see, and then be tactical, much more tactical about how we engage. Because we are working in an environment right now where the media landscape has changed. The way that we absorb information has changed. And by we, I mean like a general public. I'm talking about decision makers. But across the board, we are bombarded by information, most of it bad. And how do we pierce through the noise? So I want to make sure that, when I'm encouraging organizations to make that calculation, to go and speak out publicly, it isn't about just contributing to noise. It's about piercing through the noise and also understanding who is your target. Often we communicate to our supporter audience in ways we invest much more in communicating to our supporter audience than we do to our advocacy targets and the people that we're trying to influence. And I think that the other thing around how do you actually bring about change, just very quickly, is we aren't asking governments for favours. These are obligations. Yep. These are obligations of states to be responsible international actors. If you have a seat at the table in the international sphere, that comes with obligations. And those obligations are not just about having a moral imperative, they are legal. They are obligations that states have signed. And, they are meant to live into those. And when they fall short of those, we should hold them to account. And secondly, is the same thing applies for the humanitarian in the settings that we're operating in. A lot of them are conflict settings. A lot of them are governed by international humanitarian law. And so that is our other leverage. We should not see the law as an add-on or something that we reference as a footnote. We should see it as the standard to which people should be protected, and we should be encouraging either the warring parties or the states that are actually supporting responses to live in and up to their responsibilities. And lastly, I'm saying don't be louder, but be smarter. But what I am saying is don't be silent and hide behind the false mythology that saying anything will jeopardize your operational presence.
Thanks so much for that, Tirana. This session, I think, ends really on this note of engagement really matters. Small secret, I used to be part of MSF. At the time, it was still confusing independence with isolationism. Those are not the same. I think this morning's session really illustrates the need for engagement, particularly also with local civil society, with human rights defenders. Use your voice, not only louder, but particularly also smarter and better, as Tirana just said. I think that gives us a lot of food to go on for the rest of the day. So I'm going to thank you for attending this morning session, for your question. I'm also going to thank you who were online with us. Sorry not for allowing you to ask any questions, but please put your messages and comments out on social media channels and elsewhere. I'm going to wish you a very productive second day in person here in Berlin. And of course, I'd like to thank particularly Tirana, Hassan and Sorcha for their contributions. Please join me thanking them.